This can be kind of daunting. We're looking at recruiting and staffing, training and development, comp and benefits, org and job design, employee relations, compliance. And then we've actually added an EDI component. So just so you know, we're going to be talking a little bit about equity, diversity, and inclusion in these areas as we go along. But on Thursday, we actually have, because I think it is so important, and of course it's timely right now, there's a lot of energy around this particular topic, and I'm happy about that. But we're actually going to kind of give it a dedicated segment as well, so that we can spend a little more time, delve a little deeper, and talk not just necessarily about EDI in relation to the functions of HR management, but also some of the things that you guys can do as leaders to encourage equity, diversity, and inclusion in your own libraries, okay? So we're gonna dive in and start where it all begins, right? With those org charts. You guys have probably seen these. You may not have actually had to design these, but this is something that HR is typically responsible for. Really, really, really important for you guys to kind of understand how positions are created, how they're modified, et cetera. Because when you're in a situation where HR is removed from you, separate from you, this whole thing is just going to continue as a status quo, right? They're not really understanding or have an intimate knowledge of the inner workings of your library, right? How your service models may have changed, that maybe you need less middle management. Maybe you want more paraprofessional or line staff. You know, they really don't understand the inner workings of libraries, let alone how you guys may be making changes. And so as you make service changes, you want to consider making staffing changes to support those service changes. Okay, so kind of important to understand. So HR typically, though, will maintain all of these organizational charts. We usually have what we call a position control, which means that these are all budgeted positions. So they've got a classification, they've got a dollar amount, they actually have a number assigned to them. So when you talk to HR about org and job design, that's kind of where they're coming from. We make recommendations within the structure that would benefit the organization. Again, in my situation, I was able to do that because I had that kind of understanding and that level of contact with staff. You guys may not see that happen, so you may have to initiate that contact with HR to initiate those sorts of changes. Track and turnover rates. You see them do maybe exit interviews. If you guys aren't doing those in-house, hopefully HR is doing them to really understand why you're having the turnover. Hopefully HR is helping you, if you're not doing this on your own, to actually develop career ladders, right? So that people actually have a real organic way of moving up throughout the organization. And then of course, we're involved in succession planning. Most of you know there was a lot of concern about succession planning probably 10 years back, right? They were talking about this mass turnover that was going to happen. And then the economy just kind of it tanked. People's retirements, you know, weren't where they needed them to be, so nobody left. So as opposed to kind of seeing this mass exodus, what we've seen with libraries is people kind of slowly trickling out. All right. So when we look at org design and recruitment, the thing that I want you guys to really think about is as a position comes available, right, a vacancy. And this is, I know we're in an odd place now. Many of you have probably had to lay folks off because of COVID. Hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully you didn't have to permanently eliminate positions as a result. But when we get back, and we will get back to kind of normal operations, and a vacancy occurs, to actually take some time to be thoughtful about that. Don't just automatically fill it. Hey, we've got an L2 that's open, we're gonna fill it with an L2. Hey, we've got a senior librarian, we've got a specialist, we've got a library assistant. Don't just automatically plug the hole. Take a look, right? What's the nature of the workforce we have today? What are their skill sets, right? What's their aptitude? Are they going to be able to meet our needs in terms of the services that we're actually providing? So we're looking at the people, but we're also looking at the classifications, right? When you look at those job descriptions, do they actually suit? Are they in alignment with the direction that the library is going? Or do we want to talk about maybe changing this position and making it something else? Okay. So really important to think about that, right? First, what we're looking at is it's alignment all the way down, right? When we look at strategic HR, it's alignment all the way down. So we look at the mission statement, the organization's goals, right? So what is our library's kind of mission statement? A lot of us are modifying it now, right? It's much more moving out into the community. Big emphasis on outreach, being a community hub, community partnerships. We're kind of in flux to a certain extent. So kind of thinking about that, we're reinventing ourselves to a certain extent. What job titles or classifications are going to help us in meeting that goal? And then when we look at that and we look at those job descriptions, right? What's the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required to fill those? Does our current workforce have it? Okay, so really be thoughtful about these as they come up, right? So some possible approaches and things that I did, because I do classification work, reclassifications, class revisions, right? Some of you may actually have seen these where we've gone in and we've modified a particular class. Sometimes it's minimal, right? Sometimes I may take a librarian 2 position and I may add supervisory responsibilities. I know that's never popular, but I have been known to do something like that. I am a bad person, I admit, and apologize. So there are things that we can do on kind of a minor level. The other thing that we can do is we can look at new classifications, right? Completely developing something that we haven't ever had before. A lot of you may be seeing outreach specialists. A lot of libraries, I think like Illinois Public has actually an equity, diversity, inclusion, social justice officer now that's actually in-house in their library. Maybe you have a homeless advocate that's in your library. So looking at maybe creating new positions, stuff that may not necessarily even exist in your city, county, university, right? You can do these things in-house with HR. You can also contract out, right? One of the things that you can do before you decide to actually go and modify these positions is consider filling them on a temporary basis. And I love doing this, right? This is where we can, in most cases, if you talk with HR, there's some flexibility there in terms of what you can do on a temporary basis. You may be able to create a not to exceed 6-month new position. Or maybe you say, hey, you know, and again, I know this is not very popular, but maybe we decide that we don't necessarily need management level staff here. Maybe what we want is a paraprofessional staff here, or maybe we want a librarian here. We might consider downgrading, or we might consider upgrading. We can play with that on a temporary basis to see kind of what works best for our library. Okay. The other thing that you may see happen here on occasion, and I just want you guys to be mindful of this, is when we talk about reclassifications, you may have an incumbent, right? Somebody who's actually working in a class, but they're working beyond their classification. In most cases, it's beyond their classification. And so they've, not just in terms of workload, but in terms of responsibilities, they've taken on a lot of higher level duties. Maybe you have a library assistant, maybe, or an aide or a page that's doing reference work on a desk, right? Consistently, you know, not a small portion of their shift, but I mean, consistently. You actually are scheduling this individual knowingly that they are working consistently beyond their class. That's another way that we would look at a reclassification. We would look at that individual. We would look at the amount of time that they've been in that particular position, how long they have been working above their classification, what proportion of their duties are beyond their classification. And HR would hopefully come back to you and say, you know, is this something that's actually necessary? Do you have somebody else that's actually in an appropriate class that can do these duties? If that's the case, maybe we compensate them for the time that they've been working beyond their class, and then we send them back down to do the duties that are actually within their classification or their scope. Or do we need to actually give them a permanent bump up? Now, keep in mind that HR is not excited if this is a way for you to give somebody a promotion. This is not what this is about. Okay, not what this is about. So don't plug somebody into a position, start working them beyond their class, hoping that they're not going to have to compete and they will automatically get promoted to whatever that class is. Okay, that's not a solution. There's another way for us to be able to do that. But again, just want to kind of make you familiar with the different work that can be done here in classifications. And always, 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 I think best approach is to be completely transparent about the state of the position, the possibility, things that you're considering. If it's something that you're holding on a temporary basis and you want to play with it, let staff know that, okay? Because when you don't automatically fill a position, people have a tendency to get nervous. I know at Berkeley, when I would hold the position, they immediately thought she's holding it vacant until budget and they're going to cut that position. And things would, you know, people would panic, you know? things would get adversarial, bad situation. I would just be transparent about what we were trying to do. It would actually end up in creating opportunities for other people to get experiences, and the relationships were a lot better. Okay, recruiting and staffing. So things that HR do or does. Creating and posting job ads, right? Screening applications and resumes, delivering examinations, coordinating and conducting interviews. We extend job offers typically. We'll usually write the offer letters. We'll do the onboarding typically and the orientation. But what I found in other libraries, a lot of you guys are actually having significant overlap in some of these areas. And where you're not, I would like to encourage you to have more overlap in some of these areas. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of these in more detail. So getting into your recruitments, get your hands dirty. Assisting with the creation and placement of your job posting. Okay, so again, if your HR department doesn't have intimate knowledge of how you guys operate, what they're going to basically do is they're going to go into the formal job specs and they're going to copy and paste, okay? And you'll get a very dry and very regimented job posting, okay? So important, if you can, to try to insert yourself into this and maybe add a little flavor. It may mean that you add a little narrative about some of the highlights of your library. Maybe it's your search statistics or it's the community that you're in. One of the coolest things I thought about Berkeley, there were a lot of cool things about Berkeley, but man, our tool lending library was like state of the art and it's just awesome. So, you know, highlighting some of the cool things, talking about the different culture. Those are some of the things that you can definitely do. When we talk about the actual posting, and we'll talk more about this when we get into the equity, diversity, the EDI portion, but placement. HR, again, doesn't necessarily know that we might have different committees, like Reforma, for instance. There are a lot of opportunities, right? When you look at ALA, PLA, CLA, a lot of organizations through ALA where we have committees that we can actually, you know, they're promoting diversity, encouraging like librarians of color, et cetera, right? Via these committees, that you can have access to those groups, that you have access to listservs, right? That you're actually out in the community, that you're attending conferences. You may want to actually post jobs in your library. In a lot of cases, you know, job listings actually live in HR. People that are in your library on a daily basis that might be interested in working for you, totally unaware. Okay, libraries may also be totally unaware of like maybe San Jose State University, or if you've got a local feeder university that has library programs, completely unaware of those things. Okay, so that's another opportunity for partnership so that you get better exposure and you'll get a much more diverse applicant pool. Exam content and process, interviews, reference checks. We're going to talk more in detail about these. So when I talk about the assisting of the creation of your job posting, you can see these side by side, right? This is typically on the left, the NeoGov posting. If I were basically just to go in and auto-populate, which is usually what HR is probably going to do, unless you got a really, really dedicated representative or HR partner over there, you can see, man, it's really dry. Give you a definition of the class, give you the characteristics. You look over here to this library clerk position, and it looks much more appealing. Here in Arcadia, we have a position to, you know, for me, it's just, I don't know, it's more engaging. It draws me in. It seems less sterile, right? So you can help in that way. The other thing is language. When we talk about EDI, and I'm going to abbreviate, not because I'm trying to make any slight, but just for ease. We talk about language. It's really important to think about the language. For instance, you could use the word strong in a job posting. I've been known to do that. I used to do that all the time. What we're actually learning is words like strong may alienate persons with disabilities, may alienate women. Maybe something like resilient actually might be a word that they identify more with. So be really mindful of language, okay? And HR, a lot of HR departments are actually starting to integrate software that flags these. But if yours doesn't have that option, it's something to be mindful of. Okay. Questionnaires and scoring. Again, when we're talking about actually building these things, HR is probably going to build their supplemental questions based on the classification information. All right. So you may want to get your hands in there, because if what you need is a librarian with like a whole lot of programming experience, or maybe somebody who's had a lot of experience working with a teen population, or if you've developed, like I said, a new position and maybe you're doing a homeless advocate position, something related to mental health, you're going to actually want to develop some questions that can help you weed down that pool, right? So that those individuals, when they're responding to their questionnaires, will rise to the top, right? Because those are going to be essentially kind of those preferred qualifications. So again, when we talk about targeted recruitments, we're looking at you guys actually going and seeking out those individuals. Passive job seekers, those are going to be your friends, right? Those are going to be those people at conferences that you know or you meet, or they're speakers and they excite you and you think, you know what, it's a long shot, but we've got a vacancy and I would love for them to be part of the organization. You're able to do that. HR is not able to do that. Okay. So that's something for you to keep in mind, that your library will benefit greatly if you guys actually are able to get your hands into some of these things. All right. So you getting your hands into examination processes. Okay. So typically what you see when we do examinations is we've got performance examinations, we've got written examinations, we've got oral examinations. What I typically did is I was using written examinations typically for my entry-level positions. We had a library page, library aide, library assistant, right? We're kind of our first 3 levels of the paraprofessional classifications. And I would get huge, responses. Library aide, I would get 800 applications easy within a week to 2 weeks. And I was screening all of those on my own. So written examinations are, for me, a much more efficient way to test large groups, larger populations. One of the bad things about written examinations is they typically will have an adverse impact, right? Especially on certain populations of color who may not test well in a structured environment. So when we look at adverse impact, we're going to have to adjust to make sure that we're not biased against particular groups, right? Especially if we're looking to increase our diversity, we're weeding them out at the front end through our testing process, not good, right? Performance examinations, sometimes you may see these for some of your higher level positions where, say, you have somebody present a budget or something like that to a panel, right? I don't think in most libraries that we probably have as many performance exams. These usually are reserved for classifications, maybe in, say, like solid waste or maintenance, where people are doing a lot of physical activity, physical work. We want to make sure that they're able to do that, okay? Oral examinations are probably really common in your organization. If HR, for instance, has done a written examination, you guys may still be doing oral panels, okay? So there's a difference here. There's an oral exam, right? Which is actually scored, and that score determines placement on the eligible list, right? So I'm going to say eligible list for the first time. I probably should have said it sooner. But we do the bulk of our hiring. Probably most of you are being forced to hire off of an eligible list, right? It's not like people just walk into your library, submit an application, you can sit down, talk with them, and then they're starting the job next week, right? Much more structured, much more bureaucratic in most cases than that. So the examination then determines their placement on the eligible list, okay? The oral interviews that you're conducting, if they're interviews and not exams, are selection interviews, right? So there is a difference there. So important to understand, all right? So written, we've got cognitive tests, physical ability tests. Typically we see performance, sample job tasks. Again, like I gave you the example of maybe if we've got a manager that comes in and we want them to deliver a budget, or maybe make some type of presentation, or give us an example of dealing with an employee conflict scenario. Those are going to be types of performance or even oral exams. Personality tests, integrity tests. I've worked for employers that have used these. I would not recommend them. They probably don't have any place in libraries. The other thing that I want to bring up here is, as part of the examination process, some individuals will include medical examinations. So I don't know if any of your libraries are doing that. Important to understand that you cannot require a medical examination until after you've extended a conditional offer of employment, and you have to be requiring them of everyone that you're extending that offer to, okay? You can't be singling an individual out. And if you are doing that because you're concerned that the individual may have a disability, if indeed the medical examination determines that there is a disability present, you as an employer are still required to follow through with that job offer and provide employment if that individual can do the job with or without an accommodation, okay? So really think about whether this is something that's even appropriate. The other thing that we often see when we're screening applications is you may do background checks, criminal background checks, or you may even have something on your application that asks about somebody's criminal history. Just so you know, in the state of California, we actually finally came around to, we call it banning the box, but we're no longer allowed to ask again until after we've extended a conditional offer of employment about somebody's conviction history. So any questions about that part so far? We have a Q&A, so I will stop periodically. But I just wanted to see if anybody had any questions about background checks, medical exams, that sort of thing. Let me know if I need to go more into maybe the eligible list and the establishment of those. I'm happy, especially given the size of the group, to tailor this to anything that you guys need. Okay.
I had a quick question, Jenifer.
Yeah, Laura.
The sample job tasks, are there limits HR-wise as to what you can assign as a sample job task for somebody to prepare for an interview process?
When you say prepare for an interview process, is this something that you're just providing them in advance so that they can get an idea as to the sort of things you're going to be asking them, or is this something they're going to actually have to perform?
So let me give an example. I work in a children's department. So whenever we have somebody coming in for like a storyteller role, we ask them to prepare a story time. But our clerk roles have been changing, especially with the pandemic, and story time is no longer a primary concern of that position. It's shifted to be like different preparation of programs and activities and virtual things. So are there limits to what you can ask them to prepare? Like, say you wanted them to prepare a virtual story time and share it with, you know, the interview panel to review. Is that something that you can do, or is that kind of frowned upon just because of the technology limits?
Well, I mean, that's actually, it's a really valid point. I think one of the things that's interesting about what you say is, again, looking at our classifications, right? Because a lot of them, the way that we have them written, tech may not even be a part of that. So when we look at examinations, like you're talking about, we look at job relatedness. That's the key right there in terms of what you can ask, what you can require of a person. So if, for instance, if we talk about a page and there's nothing related to, not story time specifically, it wouldn't have to be specifically story time, but if there's nothing related to maybe programming, if there's nothing at all in the classification that alludes to their required technical skills, then what I would say is you really want to try to get in there and update your job specs. Okay, because if it's in your job specs, and again, when you're writing your job specs, don't be so specific that it leaves you hanging out, right? When your service models change, you want to try to be broad and general enough with those that they provide you some flexibility so that you're not constantly rewriting them. But if the information and if those skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities are represented in the job spec for that class that you're testing, then absolutely you want to design exercises and activities that assess those skills.
Awesome. Yeah, that answers it perfectly.
Did it? Okay. I know HR often kind of takes the easy way out with these vague responses. I want to make sure I don't do that to you guys.
No,
it's a bad habit. Okay. Yeah. So hopefully, but I mean, like I said, I can tell you that there are a lot of specs that are pretty outdated, and HR is not going to be excited to take that on. So, take it upon yourself, you guys, to kind of look through your job specs. You actually should be able to see, there's usually a date on there when they were last revised, go through and, and take a look at them and see how relevant they actually are. Because it's going to be problematic. I guarantee you it's going to be problematic. You can see that, I mean, everything stems from the job spec in terms of the work they're doing, how you're testing, what you put in your job posting, the questions that you ask during your interview, right? Everything's going to stem from that job spec. So really important that those are in alignment with what you guys are doing in your libraries. So thank you. Very, very good question. I appreciate it. So selecting candidates for the interview. For those of you guys who are using eligible lists, what you may find in Berkeley was really cool, man, because what we had open lists, which means I could have a list of like 200 people. We would categorize them category 1, category 2, category 3. The highest CAT typically reflected the highest score on the examination, right? And so the great thing was, maybe great, may not be great, depending on where you're from, but my managers, supervisors could hire anybody on that list. They didn't have to go in any particular order. If you do abide by rule of the list, what that means is that if you have candidate number 6, say they're in rank order, candidate number 6 on the list, man, you look at that application, you've looked at their responses, supplemental questionnaire, you really, really want to see this person, you've got to interview 1 through 5 before you can even call them in. So that's rule of the list. Okay. And again, that's actually kind of the idea behind that is that we're bringing the best qualified candidates in first, right? Which tells you the importance of a good quality examination, right? You want to be able to assess them on the skills that are essential for that particular position, right? So that's the difference between the open and rule of the list. Your interview panel, things that I always tried to do in Berkeley is try to keep those people consistent. I know that there are a lot of individuals, they'll do interviews for a position and it's like, I would see interviewers walk in and out. And I'd be like, what's going on? Oh, they're having interviews. But so-and-so was actually interviewed the last person. Yeah, I know, but she's going on lunch, so I'm going to take this next one. We as humans are, right, very subjective. So you've got to really think about that inconsistency and how that's going to impact the ultimate scoring and the results. So where you can, and I know it's a pain, but I always tried to keep my interview panel cohesive and consistent, use the same people so that I know they're using the same criteria, right? Crafting appropriate and legal interview questions. We've kind of already talked about that a little bit. Thank you for the question. But in terms of what we're looking at there, we want job relatedness, job relatedness, job relatedness. Okay. Whenever you ask a question, think about, is this related to the job? Is this something that is going to be required of them in order for them to be successful in completing these particular essential functions? If it's not, then reconsider putting that question on your interview sheet, right? Rating your interviewees. One of the things that I liked, we already talked about consistency in a panel. It's difficult if you've been a rater. A lot of you probably been raters, right? To try to figure out, what's a 10, what's an 8, what's important here? What kind of criteria do I use? Ask HR for a rubric to help you in your rating, right? Or maybe you can develop your own. The great thing about those is that, you've given people a criteria, right? An objective criteria, not subjective, but an objective criteria to try to kind of eliminate some of the bias and subjectivity that we see in ratings, right? And again, here, when we talk about selecting the best candidate for the position, for me, the best candidate's not necessarily number 1 in rank order, right? They may have done exceptionally well. They may test exceptionally well. But maybe the responses to supplemental questionnaires weren't in line, right? Maybe they don't have the skill set that I'm actually looking for this particular job. Maybe they didn't do well in the interview, right? So when you look at selecting the best candidate for the position, you want to take into account their examination. You want to take into account the application information, if you've required essays and supplemental questionnaires. All of those things, right? All of those things can be taken into account when you're doing your hiring. All right. And I don't know if I talk about it here, but I want to make sure to cover it. One of the things that we often talk about is fit, right? And I think that libraries need to really think about this idea of fit being a criteria for selections, because one thing we will look at when we look at EDI on Thursday is we typically have a very homogeneous workforce. Right? So when we look at fit, in a certain sense, we may just be exacerbating that situation, right? We are adding more of the same. And that may not necessarily be in our library's best interests. So something to think about when you consider fit. All right. Reference checks. A lot of HR departments will do these. In some cases, these may be on you. Okay. So when you are actually completing reference checks, I would ask you, one, to do them. Two, try to find people that are actually supervisors of these individuals. You are typically looking for professional references. I try to have at least 3 professional references. A lot of times what I will do is I will actually go back to the organization, not necessarily the individual that's been listed as a reference, right? See if a current or previous supervisor is willing to talk to me as opposed to maybe a coworker, right? Might give me a different perspective. Important to do your reference checks. If they don't respond, which is often the case because people are really terrified of giving references for people because they're worried about being litigated. All right. What I would do in that case is I would go back to the candidate that you're considering, let them know you haven't heard back from the references, ask them if they can maybe pave the way for you a little bit here. Say, hey, can you reach out to them? Let them know that I need a call back in order to offer you the job because you're not getting the job unless I complete the reference check. Okay, that sort of thing can help. The other thing is if that individual still doesn't circle back within 48 to 72 hours, have them give you an alternate. Okay. So reference checks. And these are some sample questions that you can ask, right? Again, job relatedness. And by sticking to these, you're going to make it a lot easier on your reference to be able to respond, to not be afraid, to not feel awkward, to not worry about what they say and feel like they're getting trapped into something. All right. So there's more information on OPM. You can go ahead and click on that link if you want to get more information on how to conduct reference checks, but that's something good for you to be involved in. Giving them. Right? So on the other end, and I can tell you reference checks, giving references, HR, terrible, right? If you see an HR department listed as a reference for your potential hire, you are getting jack from them, right? They're basically going to verify the classification, the time spent in that classification, their work dates. And I don't even think most of them now will tell you whether or not they're eligible for rehire. So you get squat, right? Which is sad because in reality, we actually are protected from liability. Employers have immunity, right, when providing references. Now, the key here is that it's free from malice, right? If you're talking smack about somebody to make sure that they don't get the job, then if they find out that you were the reason or you interfered with their ability to gain employment, they can come after you. But if it's true, objective feedback, then they have no recourse. Okay, so just something to keep in mind that you are protected. And when you're trying to get references for folks, this is something you can remind them of too, that they are protected. All right, so Q&A, folks. Anything come up for anybody? If not, I have a question for you guys.
I have a question though.
Yeah.
And this is going back to the interviewing process. And it has to do with, well, I'm going to put an example of something that happened to me during one of the interviews that we conducted.
Okay.
We had an opening for a bilingual person. And the person that came in, he was all, he was on the spotlight, shining and all this. He was saying the right things at the right time. So it was like, great. But after we ended the interview, he never interviewed in Spanish. We didn't hear anything in Spanish at all because it was not in the classification that they were not going to be able. They will not be answering questions in Spanish. But he said that he spoke Spanish, so I was left out with the need to try to find out whether or not he was the right candidate for the job. And I consulted with the other 2 people that were helping me out with the interview. And they were saying, well, why don't you bring him back on? And have him just see if we can do something in addition to that, right? So was that something that can be done?
So there are a couple things there that are a little messy that make me cringe a little bit.
Yeah, I see. Here's the reason why.
Yeah, and you were right. And then I think your gut was kind of like, ooh, this feels like it might not be right. And usually, to be totally honest with you, as intimidated as people are about HR, really for the most part, if you follow your gut and common sense, you'll usually find that you're in alignment with the rules and the regulations anyway.
Can I tell you what the end result of it?
In your case, one thing I would ask you is, was bilingual preferred actually in the job posting?
Yeah.
And did you guys assess language skills of any of the other candidates?
They were listed on the on the qualifications that we were given, that they were all bilingual.
So they all said that they were bilingual.
Yes.
Yeah. So it sounds like what you guys did is you were only interested in following up with this guy because he was your top candidate.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think everything actually is okay so far. What I would say, because a lot of times what you'll do is you guys will do your interview panel, right? And you'll narrow it down. So maybe you have 1 or 2 finalists. And then what you can do is you can kind of bring them back in, dot the I's, cross the T's. So I think in a case like this, I think it's pretty lousy to kind of ambush somebody after they've already left the room and bring them back into the panel. What I would probably recommend is, you know, again, maybe I don't know if you'd want to do the references first or second, but you could contact that individual and say, hey, you know, you did well in your interview. We're strongly considering you. We did say in the listing that we're looking for someone with bilingual skills. I'm going to now ask you a couple of questions and I want you to respond in Spanish to demonstrate those skills. And you would have been fine.
All right. Yeah, because we ended up back again. And he wasn't really able to speak Spanish. He understood Spanish.
Yeah.
Okay. For the purpose of our hiring, we needed someone that was fluent in Spanish.
Right. And I mean, conversational Spanish, right? Very different than what people are learning in school.
Right.
And I mean, you guys really do. And I can tell you that after I left, I was telling Christine that when I left Berkeley Public Library to go back to school, I got called back by the city of Berkeley, the central HR. And they were asking me to do some part-time stuff. And so I was just kind of filling in and conducting examinations and stuff for other departments. And I can tell you, I did one, it was really fun. It was for forestry. And we needed people that were arborists that were going to go out and actually trim like big, you know, Berkeley's got some nice trees, big redwoods, big oaks, big pines. And one of the requirements was, you know, you guys need to be able to climb. Only experienced climbers and trimmers should come to this. And it was amazing to me how many people showed up that had never, I mean, short of maybe when they were 5 or 6 or 7, that had played on trees in their grandparents' backyard, had never done that kind of work. So this again is just right. It's an example of how important it is to make sure that whether it's during your examination process or it's in your interview process, that you guys are addressing and making sure that that candidate actually has all of the skills, right, that you need in order for them to perform that particular job. Otherwise, what happens? You hire them, you bring them on, you find out they don't have the language skills, you've got to term them, and then you've got to start all over again, which really sucks. So does that, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it does. It does. Because,
yeah. Yeah. And you don't need to physically bring them back in, and you don't need to reconvene your whole panel. That could be something where you just buy the phone, you know, and you have that conversation. And at that point, you would be able to go back to your panel and say, his language skills maybe are at a 5. We're looking for a 10. Who's our next candidate in line? And maybe you go back and you test them. And then, you know, you may be at a point where you say, well, we'll take this guy, even though the language skills aren't great, or maybe this guy didn't interview as well, but the language skills are really there. And that's a priority for us, right? So what's the most crucial for them to actually be successful in the position? The great thing is I'm glad you actually included it in your job posting. The worst thing you can do is turn around and test somebody on language skills when it in no way shows up in your classification or your job posting. So, all right. So I want to ask you guys a question just really quickly, because I know a lot of this is about kind of getting your hands into HR's world. Have any of you found that you've been successful in kind of creating those relationships? And if so, how have you done that? Anybody that has any stories about creating partnerships with their HR person?
not
All
job
right.
related.
Okay, that's all right. Silence says a lot. So,
Yes.
you know, I mean, they're not, I don't know, some of them may be terrifying. I never found myself to be particularly terrifying, you know, and in most cases, love to learn about stuff that's going on in different departments, and would love the help, because HR doesn't like getting you a candidate pool that's useless to you either. All it means for them is that they're going to have to kill that list and start over again, which they don't want to do. Right? Their goal is to get you an eligible list that hopefully in Berkeley, we could use it for a year, but if it was a good list full of qualified candidates, we could extend it for another year. That's my dream, right? Is to not have to spend time in examinations, to know that I went out once, you know, and I maximized that time, that effort, and got you a list of, you know, 50, 60, 150 candidates that all would work for you. All right. So anyway, something to think about, trying to kind of establish those relationships. All right, so we're going to kind of go quickly through this next segment. Benefits and compensation. You guys are probably familiar with what HR does here. A lot of you, what you're going to see is probably in, and I saw that from a few of you that responded to the survey, you may not be responsible for the leave tracking, but you're probably going to be responsible for determining eligibility and leave approval. Right? A lot of you may also be first line of defense when it comes to workers' comp claims. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take a look at some of these things. All right. So protected leaves, Family Medical Leave Act, California Family Rights Act, Pregnancy Disability Leave. Those are three that we're going to actually focus in on today. FMLA is going to be your federal, right? So we're going to go into detail on each of these. CFRA and PDL are both California state benefits. Now, as much as it's great for you guys to be familiar with the federal leaves and laws, typically what we see is that California is so employee favorable that we trump federal, right? Federal you can kind of think of as the bar, right? That's the basic or the minimum that we have to provide our employees. California, in most cases, in terms of our labor law, we exceed that. We exceed that obviously in terms of minimum wage. We also exceed that in terms of benefit and leaves, okay? So we'll look at each one of these here. Protected leave. So what this actually means when we talk about protected, and if you guys can actually, there's a nice little cartoon over there to the right. I won't spoil it for you, but you'll be able to figure it out. It means that you are entitled to reinstatement, right? After you return to that leave, return from that leave to a comparable position. Comparable position means it doesn't necessarily have to be identical, right? Pay, benefits, working conditions, those need to be comparable. Duties and responsibilities need to be comparable, needs to be close to the original work site, right? You can have somebody driving 50 miles out of the way now that they've come back from work. And you also want a comparable shift or work schedule, okay? So that's what protected leave means. It means you're entitled to reinstatement to a comparable position after you come back. Family medical leave, right? FMLA, we've all heard about it. And again, in most cases, we actually trump FMLA, but it's important to understand that sometimes we have what we call concurrent leaves. So you guys need to be familiar with FMLA. FMLA is 12 work weeks of leave. So essentially it's like 3 months during a 12-month period, right? For the purposes of the following: birth of a child, right? To care for a newborn, or if say you've adopted or taken in a foster child, to care for your spouse, your child, your parent who has a serious health condition, to care for yourself, right? If you have a serious health condition and you're unable to perform the job. And then we also have a couple of clauses in here for military care. One for exigency arising as a result of active duty service, and then the other is to care for a member of the military, right? So they get 26 weeks as opposed to the 12 weeks for the other conditions. Important to understand that a lot of our employees probably don't qualify for FMLA, right? Our part-timers, it's a real struggle because FMLA, I think, requires, I want to say it's like 1250 hours worked in the last 12 months. In most cases, our part-timers, if you're half-time, you're doing 1040. You may even be doing less than that if you're like 15 hours a week. Okay. A lot of new hires, because they haven't been with the employer for a year, will not be eligible for FMLA. Okay, so important to understand those things. When we look at CFRA, right, which is the state's version of this act, this was originally actually developed as a a bonding period, but they've continued to expand it, and they expanded it again just recently this last year in 2021. Again, we've got 12 work weeks in a 12-month period, birth, adoption, placement of a foster child, to care for an immediate family member. Now, important to understand that where you saw FMLA, right, we have a limited number of individuals that this applies for, right? It's your spouse, which could include your same-sex spouse, but not your domestic partner. It's your child, it's your parent who has a serious health condition, right? CFRA opens that up, right? Spouse, minor child, parent, domestic partner, grandparent, grandchild, sibling, adult child, right? So this actually applies to many more of your family members than what FMLA may. So you may be eligible here, but not FMLA, right? Again, when the employee is unable to work due to a serious health condition, so same as FMLA, and then for qualifying exigency and to care for a member of the active duty or military that has a health condition or concern. So similar, but what you won't see here, an important distinction here is that CFRA does not consider pregnancy to be a serious health condition, okay? FMLA considers pregnancy to be a serious health condition. In California, we actually have what's called PDL, pregnancy disability leave, right? So if an employee is disabled by pregnancy, childbirth, or related medical condition, it's entitled to up to 4 months of disability leave per pregnancy. Okay, so what this means is that you could essentially have an employee that's off for 4 months because of pregnancy disability, and then she has her child, and she's still entitled to what would be CFRA, FMLA. You'd run them concurrently, which means simultaneously you would run those balances down for her to bond and care for the child. Okay. In addition to that, you may actually, once that individual returns, depending on the situation, with the disability, the pregnancy disability, that individual may not be able to do full duties upon their return to work. So there might be an accommodation that's required to be provided by the employer. Okay. So concurrent leaves are probably the most tricky, right? Which is the idea that if I am taking time off to bond with my child, I don't get 12 weeks of CFRA plus 12 weeks of FMLA, right? Because I'm taking that leave for the same thing. So those things will be exhausted, right? They'll run simultaneously, or what we say concurrently, right? So you don't get that plus that. Does that make sense to individuals? But if I take time off to care for myself under FMLA, and then I need time off to take care of my domestic partner who is not covered by FMLA, I can have 12 weeks under FMLA to care for myself, and then 12 weeks under CFRA to take care of my domestic partner. Okay, because the clock wasn't running on FMLA when I was taking care of my domestic partner because they aren't covered. Okay, all right. So I know leaves are really kind of scary and tricky, but we've given you some really good, you guys also have a resource list that I think Christine's probably kind of pushed out, disseminated to you. And there are links to all of the oversight bodies. So FEHA, Fair Employment and Housing Act, Department of Industrial Relations. You guys have all the links in the places that you need to go to learn a little more about the leave, the bodies that oversee those, what the criteria is to qualify, what employer responsibilities are in relation to that. The websites are actually pretty user-friendly, given that it's part of this really great bureaucracy. So don't be afraid to kind of click on them and explore. All right. Effective March 29th, 2021, right? So I know Christine and I have talked about this at length, man. We kind of, I say we, but I mean, there's a large number of people involved in this we. People really dropped the ball in 2020 in terms of getting information out to folks about what sorts of leave they were entitled to. And you know, in 2020, the government, the federal government actually offered supplemental leave. Right. So it was, I think it was 80 hours of supplemental leave for employees to care for themselves, care for family members, take care of kids whose daycare or schools had been closed as a result of COVID. That ended right back in December. But it's important to know, while the federal benefit ended, the state benefit is still active and will be, I think, through the end of September. Yeah, it's there, September 2021. Okay, so important to understand that the Department of Industrial Relations in California is still offering leave, supplemental leave in terms of sick leave for the qualifying COVID-related illnesses or circumstances to employees, okay? And this is in addition to your regular sick leave, your vacation leave. It has to be COVID specific, right? And it can also be related to the vaccine, right? So it can cover time off for you to actually go and get vaccinated. It can cover time off for those of you who, and I have only gotten my first shot, but I hear the second one of Moderna is a doozy and may take me down for a day or two, but it would cover that time off as well. Okay, so again, you've got a link to this page. Know what your rights are. If your library or your city or your county is not kind of spreading the word, feel free to inquire about this, okay? Because these are things that are available to you through your employer. All right. When we talk about protected leave, does not mean that you're paid. Okay, so FMLA, CFRA, paid pregnancy disability leave doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be compensated. Okay, so when you talk about that, when you consider that, you want to take a look at your union contract. In most cases, I think all of you are probably in represented environments, and it will usually tell you specifically right there, is it going to be on paid time? Am I allowed to use my sick leave? Can I use all my sick leave and then still tap my vacation leave? In most cases, employers will actually have a clause in their memorandum of understanding or their MOUs that allow you to do that. You may also have situations where you have like a sick leave donation, which is really great for individuals who are ill or taking care of sick family members. Who have exhausted all of their leave benefits. In some organizations or libraries, they actually allow employees who have substantial leave balances. You know who these people are, man. They never miss a day. It must be a lot of vitamin C. And they've got like, sick leave balances of like 400 hours or something. And to the point that they can't accrue anymore. Sometimes they'll allow them to donate. You can use that to stay on paid status. But important to know, it doesn't guarantee that you're paid, okay? It does guarantee, in addition to allowing you to return to the comparable position, right? In addition to the job protectedness, it does say that your employer has to maintain whatever the situation is with your health insurance. If it means you having some sort of premium that you pay monthly and they pay a portion, if they cover you at 100%, whatever that situation is, they have to continue that during your period of leave, okay? So existing health insurance is continued. Right? So where we come into the money part, right? Because a lot of us, if our employer won't let us be out on paid leave during these protected leave periods, we are entitled to disability, right? Through the state. And in some cases, you may use maybe part of your leave, or say you're full-time and your leave only covers maybe 80% of your hours. We'll talk a little bit about coordination in a second here. I want to introduce this. I'm going to go back and introduce this. State disability benefits, right? A partial wage replacement. This is typically when you are on a non-work related illness, right? Injury or pregnancy. This does not cover workers' comp. SDI is not at all covered, does not cover workers' comp. Right? But what it does allow you to do is it will pay for a period of, I think 52 weeks. If you're out on extended disability, right? Qualifying disability, it will pay usually around 70% of your wages, which means if you have leave coordination through your employer to bring you up to say your 100%, whatever your pay would normally be, if you're allowed to use your leave, then you only have to use like 30% of your sick leave to make you whole. So kind of complicated. Don't know if that makes sense to folks. Feel free to ask. Paid family leave. Instead of actually taking care of yourself for your illness or injury, paid family leave, again, is where we're looking at you taking care of a spouse, parent-in-law, grandparent. And again, because these are specific California benefits, you can see that the family members that this encompasses is actually far greater and broader than what you would see with a federal benefit, right? If you need time off to bond with a child, if you need time off to take care of a family member, paid family leave is essentially like disability insurance. They'll provide you supplemental wages that will pay you 60 to 70% of your normal income. And you may be able to supplement that with your leave balances if your employer allows you. All right. Lactation accommodation, important to understand, you guys, that we have to provide these. We can't put ladies in a boiler room anymore. I had somebody do that at Berkeley, put them in a basement with a chair on a dirt floor. Can't put them in bathrooms anymore. There are requirements for us to have spaces. All right. Ideally, that would be in your facility. Some of us are part of maybe a larger building, a community services building or something like that. So you want it to be something that's semi-accessible, not the sort of thing where, you know, somebody has to drive halfway across town to get to central HR or something to find a lactation room. Okay. So there are some other requirements here. You know, we want to make sure that they have access to, it says here, electricity and alternative devices. They also need to have a place where they can put breast milk. So in a refrigerator or some kind of cooling situation. Doesn't necessarily need to be in the room where they pump, but it has to be close by. Okay, so important to know this stuff. Important to understand that we need to provide break time. It doesn't have to be paid, but break time in addition to their regular breaks. If we have an employee that needs to pump, for instance. Okay, so I mean, hopefully people aren't put off by this. We're kind of past that point. Q&A, any questions so far, you guys? I know that we're kind of flying through this.
I don't have a question, but I did want to say that it's when it comes to the benefits, if you guys are supervising people, you may not think it's your job because that's part of HR, but it does reflect on you when you're not, especially during COVID. We took a survey amongst parents in our profession, and it seems to be, there was a lot that were not in the know of their paid leave. And even though they understand this should be coming from HR during COVID, it does reflect on their supervisors who just kind of kept quiet about their entitlements. So that's just something to consider, I would say, especially if you're supervising staff out there. That's it.
Yeah, no, thank you, Christine. That was really a really good added point. And I mean, I think, you know, and I actually, Christine and I kind of talked about this at length, you know, and as an HR person or as a supervisor, I mean, I can tell you that it was at Berkeley, for instance, we had a benefit. It was 1 year of parental leave, 1 year of parental leave. And in some cases, if we had parents of a child, we employed, because, you know, libraries, people meet, they fall in love, they get married. We may employ both of the parents. That meant that each of them got a year. And it was really, in some cases, very hard for me to react with joy about the impending childbirth when I knew that I was going to lose 2 very valuable employees for a year apiece. But that being said, it's really important to be transparent here and to make people aware of the benefits. And I think that Christina is right, that goes beyond just putting a poster in your staff work areas. Okay. If you know about things, and even if you don't necessarily know everything about something, you at least now know that there are websites, there are agencies where, you know, you can direct people so that they can go and they can get more information. There are individuals that they can talk to so that they can make inquiries for themselves. Really important that you are putting what you know out there and not trying to conceal benefits that people are entitled to, because it creates terrible ill will. For good reason, So I appreciate you clarifying that, Christine. Anybody else?
Oh, yeah. I have a quick question about SDI.
Yeah.
My former employer, like they didn't pay into SDI, and a lot of people didn't know about it until, you know, you had to go on leave. Is that common? Is that common for, is that like, have you seen that at other cities or
In
this is-
most cases, what you'll see is you'll do a voluntary contribution to SDI, but it's not real common nowadays, to be honest with you, that you won't have either a mandatory or a voluntary contribution, that there won't be an enrollment. But you are absolutely right. I mean, that's an employee-funded program, SDI is. So essentially, you see it on your paychecks, right? You'll see the deductions for the SDI. And so we're all paying into a program that then when you take time off, because you're disabled or a family member is disabled, you're drawing from that. So it is an employee funded program. So you're absolutely right. If you are not paying into that and your employer hasn't, as an alternative, elected voluntary contributions, then you're not eligible, which is a difficult situation. Yeah.
Thanks.
I haven't seen that nearly as much, but I know, and I think I don't know how common it is, but employers won't pay into Social Security insurance, which is really kind of interesting. So that's, those are also good questions to ask when you're looking at prospective employers, in addition to, do they have Kaiser or PPO and what percentage do they cover? They're required to have workers' comp insurance, but they're not required to necessarily pay into Social Security or to pay into state disability benefits. So those may be things that you want to look at. Because I've seen some folks that have been really unhappy where they've worked 30 years for an employer and then realize that they're not eligible for retirement benefits because they've never paid into those. So all of those things are benefits. All of those things are considered benefits, including retirement, whether it's PERS or PARS or some other type of contribution plan. Yeah, good point. I'll have to amend the presentation. A lot of you guys may have youth workers or student workers. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. In most cases, you may, we had student workers came in twice a year. They'd usually come in around winter break and then they'd be with us through the summers. And we had a separate agency or department through the city of Berkeley that actually, did the interviews and, did all of that part, and they would essentially kind of give us these referrals, and then we could make selections and determine the youth that we wanted to have on board with us. But the great thing about these individuals was, in most cases, if there was a problem, we were able to contact YouthWorks and they would either address the issue or have the individual removed or what have you. So that's a real great place to get, it also can be invigorating, to kind of have younger, fresher, energized folks. Sometimes you feel like you need that little shot on the arm, and these individuals can bring it. It also, when again, we talk about diversity and creating applicant pools, this is a really great starter point. What we tried to do at Berkeley was take our youth workers, our student workers, we created a page or an entry-level classification that we really hadn't had previously. Our library aide was our entry-level classification. And what we learned is that because our library aides were partially benefited and had pretty good pay rates at Berkeley, we were stealing experienced pages and aides from other library systems. We weren't bringing people that had never worked in libraries into our library at that classification. So it really wasn't entry level, which is what it was designed to be. So we created a classification that was true entry level. And a lot of our youth workers actually used that as a gateway to library employment, which was really cool. So these are just kind of some of the rules and regulations. Again, if you have kind of a parent agency that's overseeing the program for you, they're going to keep an eye on this. But it's important to know. You also have a really, really great chart. And again, a link to the Department of Industrial Relations that gives you specifically the ages, how often they can work, when they're in school, when they're out of school, how late they can stay, etc. So if you have curiosity about this for yourself, your own kids, good information for you to have. Okay, workers' comp. All right. So how many of you guys are kind of the first line of defense? Do you have to take reports? Do you have to send injured employees to the hospital? How do some of you handle your on-the-job injuries? Not patrons, but employees. I know we have incidents with patrons often, but this would just be employees. Do you guys just send them to HR? Do you call HR? Do you have to fill out paperwork?
It's usually paperwork.
You
Yeah,
sound
and then
excited about it.
yeah,
It usually is paperwork. All right.
yeah, it's
So-
paperwork. Let the senior management know. Then I guess depending on how what are the nuances of the situation, then it might go to HR. And it's it's sort of
Okay, all right, thank you for that. So we're all probably, we have different levels of involvement maybe in terms of, at what point we're inserted, how long, what's required of us. But this is another kind of good thing to know because there are some basics that are the same across the board, right? Because California law basically says so. So workers' comp, just so you kind of understand, it's a type of insurance, right? Employers are required to have it. And so essentially what it means is the employees through the workers' comp system get treated for their injury and the employers are free from suit, right? Once they get into that system. So again, California employers are required to carry workers' comp insurance. We still do see people, obviously, when we're seeing people that are paid under the books, migrant workers, that sort of situation. We've got a lot of individuals that obviously aren't covered, which is why you'll see people that they'll experience heinous injuries and have to come back because they need to continue to get paid, but their treatment isn't covered, right? So what workers' comp benefits actually provide are your medical care. They may entitle you to modified work, temporary disability benefits, and that's through workers' comp, not SDI. Right. So if you are, I know somebody had asked me previously, if it's sort of situation where it's not, I was out jumping with my kids on the trampoline and I broke my ankle. We were doing trampoline during story time on work site and it was required by my job and I broke my ankle. You can be titled to disability benefits, right? So they'll continue to pay your wages while you're off work through workers' comp. That's the payment for lost time and then obviously death benefits. We don't want to get into that because it's pretty dark and dreary. So if an injury occurs, right, what do we need to do? So obviously the other thing that you need to do, and Christine was really good about reminding me of this, is even if you guys are not actually handling the paperwork, is you need to let folks know that they need to make somebody aware of what's happening, right? In libraries, in most cases, we probably don't have situations where people are dropping manhole covers on their feet or they're getting crushed by garbage trucks. Usually what we'll see, and you see that in this individual photo, we'll see RSIs, which are repetitive stress injuries. Usually from shelving, right? We'll see wrists, elbows, back, neck, pushing and pulling book trucks, and a lot of desk work, right? So you may see carpal tunnel, people, incurring those types of injuries. You may also see stress claims, which do qualify as work-related. So those are the things that are probably going to be most common. But the important thing to understand is that when employee makes you aware, and when I say you, I mean the employer. When the employee makes the employer aware, we have to provide the DWC-1 within 1 working day. I'll show you that form in a minute, but that's a California state form. And we also have to complete the injury report form 5020. That's at a minimum. Those are both state forms. Now, your library may have additional incident report forms and things that you have to fill out, but these are requirements. So you need to understand that you will not be immune from litigation if you do not provide this to the employee, right? At that time, you want to make sure that the employee is made aware of his or her rights to file a claim. If they report an injury, it does not mean that they need to file a claim. Okay, and that's really important to understand and to make your coworkers aware of. A lot of people are confused by this. Okay, I can make you aware that I've been injured on the job as kind of like an FYI, and you can give me these forms, but you cannot make me file a claim. Once I file a claim, I am in the system. I am required to get medical evaluation. And then at that point, the doctor will determine whether or not I return to work, if I return to work full duty, if I return mod duty, if they take me off altogether, right? I don't really have any say at that point. The wheels are in motion. Okay, so important to understand, not that the system is a bad thing, but you can't just opt in, opt out willy-nilly. Okay, and it's also important to understand that just because you've reported an injury does not mean that you filed a claim. Okay, so to file a claim, just so you know, you need to complete, as an employee, you need to complete that DWC-1, okay? At that point, when your employers filled that out, you filled that out, you have basically said, I want to move forward with a workers' compensation claim. All right, so a couple of different scenarios that I just want to give you, because I think these were kind of the most common things that I saw while I was working, and these are things that may come up for you. So we have an employee that reports an injury, right, that comes to you or a manager. And again, if it's not you, then direct them to a manager or somebody that you know is actually going to handle this sort of thing or knows who to send them to. But employee reports an injury, but just says, hey, you know, I just wanted to let you know, I've got, you know, some soreness. I'm okay. But, you know, I noticed it happened yesterday while I was doing this, or I've noticed that it's gotten progressively worse over the last couple of months. The second that they put you on notice is when you need to make the paperwork available to them, right? So the employer will fill out their portion of this DWC-1. And again, I'll show you the form and the links to the forms. And then you basically give it to the employee, right? And it's kind of like, it's kind of like a, I don't want to say get out of jail free card, but it's like a, you know, you can cash this in. If you decide to cash this in, you know, and you want to file a claim, then you fill out your portion and you bring it back to me, right? But so long as I have filled out my portion, given it to you, made you aware of your rights, I've met my obligation as an employer. Okay. The other thing we want to do as an employer, when we're completing the 5020 form, which is our injury report, is we'll write in there, right, all the details of it, you know, what they told us, when it happened, how it happened, what kind of pain they're experiencing and what part of their body. There are fields for all of these things. But then you'll actually write in there, and there's a box, we'll write in there, employee declined to file workers' comp claim at this time, right? No authorization for medical treatment sought. And then you guys just go about your ways. Okay. And that individual may circle back a month or so later. And at that point, what you want to do is determine, is it indeed the same injury? Do we want to use the same claim form, or is this something that's separate and we need to go down a different path? But important to know that we can kind of do these information only claims is what I call them. Okay. Scenario number 2. Okay. And important to know, right, with scenario number 1, because you haven't filed a claim, you can't just automatically, you don't get modified duty, right? We can't provide informal modified duty and say, you know, this individual, their back hurts, so they can't bend over to shelf, or, you know, their job requirement said they need to lift 50 pounds and they can't do that anymore. I'm going to make an accommodation. We don't want to get in the habit of making informal accommodations. Okay. If you guys make informal accommodations that aren't within the realm of a formal filing for workers' compensation, that employee can come back and say, well, you did it before, you've been doing it, and they can make that a permanent accommodation. Okay, so stay away from informal accommodations, please. Scenario number 2, the employee reports an injury but wants to open a claim, right? These are easy peasy, right? So we complete our portion of the DWC-1, we give that to them, they complete their portion, we've completed the 5020. And then what we'll do, depending on what your level of involvement is, you may send this to the city, you may send this directly to your third party provider. You may actually send this directly to the health center authorizing treatment, which is the position that I was in. I would actually send the forms off to US HealthWorks and say, hey, I've got somebody coming, sending them over right now. Here's their authorization for treatment. You're seeing them. And essentially it's on the City of Berkeley's tab, right? So that's scenario number 2. Now, when those individuals come back, you may find again that we've got modified duty, that we have restrictions greater than that. Maybe they've been pulled off work, or maybe they've been released to full duty. Okay. A lot of things can come out of those medical evaluations. Number 3, employees injured must be taken to the ER immediately, right? So those are kind of scary, right? If somebody's been bleeding, or somebody's maybe broken a bone. I've had individuals that have had seizures, been unconscious, you know, bad situations where you know that the medical treatment is the priority, not the paperwork, right? Let the treating physicians know that it's a work-related illness or injury, and so they're authorized for treatment, and then you fill out the paperwork in the rear. Okay, so let's take a look at these forms. The DWC-1, which is on the left, this actually, where I wrote DWC-1, used to have an official seal for the state of California. So my staff referred to it as the Sealy form. So when I did trainings, I had to refer to this as the Sealy form. So whatever you call these things, the important thing is to make sure that they are available. and that you actually are providing these to employees at the time of work-related injuries, okay? So we talked a little bit about possible outcomes. Employee may be released to return to work full duty, which is awesome, right? They may have given them a brace or something and they looked at their job description, right? In some cases, you may need to provide the job description if the employee isn't able to give that, or maybe the employee is not forthcoming in giving that. You can reach out to the treating physician and say, you know, these are the employee's job requirements. Are they able to complete these job requirements based on their current condition? Okay, and they will tell you yes or no. Or if, like in scenario number 2, the employee is released to return to work, but with restrictions, we call that modified duty. Okay, in some cases, what that may mean for you guys is if the physician basically says, you know, the employee can't come into contact with the public. I mean, I can't think of a situation where that would happen, but something that basically disqualifies them for doing almost everything, you may not be able to provide modified duty as the employer. That doesn't always happen, but it's important to know that sometimes you will actually get work restrictions that essentially disable the employee from being able to do their job. In that case, they go home, they're out on paid leave until they go back in for their next evaluation, which is usually about every 2 weeks they'll go in. And you want to make sure that you're getting updates on their work restrictions because those may change. So every time they go to an appointment, they need to provide you with their revised restrictions and the report of that appointment, okay? Employee temporarily removed from work. So we've talked about this. Again, they're out on paid leave. It's going to be a disability leave through workers' compensation, not through the state. And it actually pays them in full. It doesn't pay a portion of their wages, which means they don't tap their sick leave. They don't tap their vacation. They are out on full pay with continued benefits during this period. And again, they are required to provide you with those appointment slips, right? Every time they go in and they get reassessed, you need to know whether or not they are eligible to return to work in any capacity, okay? Mod duty or alternative work. So we've talked about modified work. We only got a couple minutes left, so I'm going to fly through this, guys. These are basically original jobs with changes so we can meet the doctor's restrictions, right? So we're changing certain tasks. We may be reducing time on certain tasks. You'll see this, like I said, a lot with computer work, mainly with lifting, a lot with shelving. Okay, so what they may say is your physician may one, limit the weight. They may take something down to 5 pounds, which may mean, okay, we're only shelving picture books, right? They may also say that they can't engage in that particular task for more than, say, 30 minutes at a time. So it means you're rotating them, right? So maybe you move them to check-in, or maybe they're working in info desk and answering phones, or maybe they go back and they're checking their email. They're doing something else, so you're varying the tasks. But you want to make sure if there isn't an ability for you to provide modified duty, that you do that. Otherwise, it costs you money, okay? Alternative work, work from the original job that meets the work restrictions. Now, when we look, and I think this is our last slide, workers' comp related to COVID, okay? At the time that we actually conducted this training last year, we still weren't clear, and the state wasn't clear on whether or not they were actually going to consider workers' comp when you actually contracted the illness at work as kind of a coverable event. They have determined that it indeed is. You need to meet certain criteria, right? So you need to test positive for COVID during an outbreak, and they're really clear about how they classify an outbreak, but it does indeed qualify you to workers' compensation benefits, just as it would if you had a slip and fall at work. Okay, so important to understand, and I think this is a really good fact sheet. There's more information on your resource sheet that Christine has either pushed out or will push out to you guys. But important for you and for your coworkers to understand that this is actually covered under workers' compensation. Okay. All right. So session 1 is done. So I know that was a lot of information. I know it's a little bit messy, and the leave stuff is never necessarily fun. I would encourage you all, before we get to the Q&A and I lose you, but I'd encourage you guys all to come back Thursday if you can stand it and you have the time, because I think it'll be really fun. We're actually going to have a more interactive session. We'll have an activity, and we're going to get to really kind of dig in a little bit to the equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is a really, really hot topic. So for those of you who are heading out, I hope to see you again Thursday. Any questions at all? Any comments? Anything anybody would like to share with the small group that we've got today?
This was a super helpful session, Jenifer. Thank you so
Oh,
much for making
cool.
all of this information so understandable.
Great.
I did have a question about workers' comp.
Yes.
Just because this has happened at my library before. So whenever a work-related injury occurs, even if the employee declines to file a claim, the manager or the HR rep, whoever should be filling out the paperwork, needs to fill out a 50/20 form and just specify that the employee declined to file a claim. Is that true?
Yeah, that's actually what the state requires. And one of the reasons that it's important to do it is your DWC-1 won't probably give you the detail on the circumstances. So one of the cool things about the 50/20, because we've kind of already talked about, you can kind of cash this in later if you want to, maybe something that happened 5-6 months ago. I mean, I don't remember the details and neither does the employee. My 50/20 is a record of that. And it's a formal record of that that'll actually accompany your DWC-1. Your incident report, if your library is doing that as an alternative, it's fine. It can be kind of redundant unless there's additional information, but these two things actually should go hand in hand, the 50/20 and the DWC-1. And one of the reasons you may not be seeing it is because it's not the one that typically will make your employer vulnerable to liability. The DWC-1 is the big one, like within 24 hours, like the clock is ticking. And that's the first thing that they'll jump on an employer for. And you can receive some pretty major fines if you haven't made sure that that's done. But the 50/20 is an accompanying document that is required. So they should be doing that 50/20.
So then the employee that experiences the injury should be filling out a DWC-1, even if they're not filing a claim.
No, the employee actually, you'll see when you go back, let's go back here one sec. So this, you can kind of see it. So you guys can see on the DWC-1, the form that's on the left side of your screen, you can see you've got an employer section down at the bottom. The employee section's up at the top. So if we're in a situation where the employee wants to file an information claim, they're just basically putting you on notice, but they don't want to seek medical treatment, you fill out the bottom, you make a copy of it, you hold on to it, and you give them the original. They don't have to fill it out.
Okay, that makes so much more sense. Thank you.
Yeah, and then I mean, basically, that's kind of like, you make it really clear to them what the difference is, and that in order for them to initiate that process, the workers' compensation process, in order for them to be eligible for the benefits, in order for them to see a physician, because important to kind of understand what a lot of people may do, and you guys may have seen this in your libraries. People will say, I don't want to file a claim, I'm just going to go see my own doctor. Well, I can tell you, especially at Kaiser, you go see your own doctor and you tell them that it happened at work, they will boot your ass out of there super fast because they don't deal with work-related injuries. They have an occupational health department for that. You need to see an authorized physician in order to be treated for workers' comp. So you may find that an employee might circle back and say, okay, well, I thought my doctor would see me, but they won't, and I want to get it treated. So now I'm going to fill out the top portion of the form, give that back to the employer, and then that will initiate the authorization for treatment process. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was in a car accident a few years ago on a work job, and I never saw a DWC-1 or a 50/20 form. I mean, like, I was fine. There were no medical issues from it. Both parties in the accident were totally fine. But I just had no idea that there was probably paperwork I should have filled out.
Yeah. Well, and that also, my guess is that one of the things that I don't know if you contacted HR or if it was just handled in-house, but there's a lot of confusion about, if you're not physically in the building and on your shift, it's like, well, I don't know, is it workers' comp or is it not workers' comp? So if there are questions about that, be sure to call your HR person. Because it's especially, one of the real gray areas is like somebody that's just returning from break and they're on the front steps coming back into the library. It does qualify. And a lot of employers will say, well, technically they weren't really on their shift and they weren't in the building. So when you have stuff like yours where it happens out in the field, I'm wondering if that might have been one of the reasons somebody dropped the ball. Hard to know. but you should have gotten both of these, and they're lucky that you didn't sue them.
All right. I was figuring there should have been a lot more paperwork than I ended up doing, which was
Yeah.
basically telling my supervisor, oh, no, I'm fine.
Right. Well, and
Right.
I mean, if you went to go get assessed, for instance, you know, like maybe you bumped your head or, you know, your back hurt a little bit, you know, you go to Kaiser, and if you don't mention to them, you know, you could even say you were in a car accident. They're not going to know that it happened while you were at work. So they may assess you, they may treat you. A lot of us have really, really good medical insurance. So we don't ever think to file workers' comp because there's not going to be any cost incurred. You know, we won't incur any cost of treatment. But it is important to understand that there is a distinction.
Yeah, thank you so much for clarifying that, Jenifer.
Yeah, workers' comp is messy. It's not fun, you guys. But yeah, I mean, like I said, check out the websites, you know, and it'll tell you right on there that the forms that are required. Those are both state forms, even though I've eliminated, I cropped the seal. But they're both official California forms, and you know, you want to make sure that your HR department, or if you guys are responsible for distributing paperwork, that you have those on file, and make sure that, you know, you just have a current version that you can photocopy. Man, when stuff is happening, you don't want to be like, you know, logging on, trying to find a PowerPoint presentation, you know, looking for the link, logging onto the site, downloading the form. You know, make sure you've got it. And the other thing is that actually on the backside, the DWC-1, I can't remember if it's 2 or if it's 4 pages, but I mean, there are instructions, just like there are on your tax forms, about how to fill out those different sections. So make sure you have them on hand. Yeah, anything else, you guys? That was a good question. Nobody ever wants to talk about workers' comp. I'm shocked. You guys are